My name is Professor Anatoly Alexienko. I'm really excited to welcome you all for another wonderful seminar. This time, I have a great pleasure to welcome a great colleague, Professor Bob Adamson. I think many of you know him really well. Some of you might need a little bit of introduction, given that we have also participants coming on Zoom. So Bob recently showed me a picture of him joining Taiyuan
Teachers College.
Teachers College,
yeah,
with a little schoolgirl who is now a professor in China. So Bob has been teaching here for the past 40 years, and he holds a number of distinguished titles, including UNESCO Chair for TVET and Lifelong Learning. He is also visiting professor of the University of Nottingham in Ningbo, and he is also an honorary professor of the University College London, as far as I understand. So Bob has published extensively on curriculum design, on reforms and foreign language education. So today we have his presentation on the Belt and Road Initiative and what it really means to educate these new intellectuals who can speak many languages, and just to implement the Chinese new initiative called the Belt and Road Initiative. So without further ado, I'll invite Bob to speak, and then we'll have a little bit of time, I guess, of his presentation to discuss and ask questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Anatoly. I'm really pleased to be able to talk about three things that I'm interested in. I hope you're interested as well. But I want to talk about China. As Anatoly was mentioning, it's 39 years since I set foot in China, and I've spent very little time out of China since then. And I want to talk about multilingualism, which is a major area of interest in the past 15 to 16 years. I've been very fortunate to be part of a national team that's been looking at multilingual education, particularly in the minority regions of China. And higher education, having been in higher education for a long time, and also not to the extent of Anatoly. I've done a little bit of research into higher education. We've got Will as well, who's here, and also an expert on higher education. I've done a little bit. I'm an amateur when it comes to that, but it's an area of interest I have. And to be able to bring the three together is a very nice moment to do so. So the Belt and Road Initiative, I'm going to talk very briefly about what it is. I'm not going to go into an enormous amount of detail. I would like to concentrate more on what multilingualism is like in China. And then I want to talk about the impact that the Belt and Road Initiative is having, and it's an emerging trend, on the provision of higher education in China. Okay. So let's move ahead. With a clicker that doesn't work. So let me use the keyboard instead. Can you do the technicals for me? Okay, well, I'm going to start off with the Belt and Road Initiative, and while we sort out the technical details. The Belt and Road Initiative, we have to be careful to use the word initiative. It is not a policy. It's not a strategy. It's an initiative, all right? And the important thing about the initiative is that it doesn't have a hidden agenda to it. That's why the word initiative, something you start, whereas a strategy has got an end point or a target and so on. So the word initiative is actually quite strongly emphasized in the policy documents for this reason. Okay, and it was introduced, as I mentioned there, by the current president, Xi Jinping, in 2013, and it's quite ambitious in scale. The number of countries that's involved, the number of people that are involved, over 4 billion people, and the number of economic production values. I'm not quite sure what that is, but it sounds very impressive that there are 21 trillion of them. So it's obviously a big deal when we're talking about the scope and the impact of it. And the idea behind it is to connect the East and the West, to do the Marco Polo in reverse. So in deference to Marco Polo, they talk about the Silk Road. And it has not only the connectivity between China and the West, there are all the countries in between with the infrastructure there that also stand in a good position to benefit from the initiative. Okay, it's got two components. One is the Silk Road economic belt, and the road is the 21st century maritime Silk Road. Now, it seems a little bit odd that the road is by sea, but that's how they've worked it out. It's a belt on land and a road by sea. But those are the two elements. And here's a map which shows, to some extent, just how ambitious this plan is. The blue one is the maritime route. You can see that it starts in Tianjin. There's a huge opportunity for Hong Kong here as well, if anybody's interested in tying in all the opportunities of Hong Kong to what Belt and Road is doing. And you can see the way that it links Southeast Asia and India and Africa and the Middle East and so on. And likewise, the Belt and Road, the belt is not a single belt. It's got several offshoots and different corridors and so on. But it eventually will get you to Rotterdam, all being well. Okay. Now, when I talk about the goals of Belt and Road, these are not the Chinese stated goals. These are goals that have been identified by academics as to the actual benefits that BRI can actually bring. So one of them is the part of the ongoing development of Western China. You know that China, very strongly on the West, is more rural, more underdeveloped. It's resource rich, but economically poor. And so it provides an opportunity for Gansu and Xinjiang and Tibet and those kind of countries, those kind of provinces to really benefit from the economic opportunities. And then we have the Zhongguomen, the Chinese dream. Yeah, that this is a chance for entrepreneurs and people of spirit and so on. In the past, it used to be the barefoot doctors. Now it's the rich capitalists from China who can go and explore and make themselves into the Chinese dream. It will facilitate commerce and it will facilitate movement of people. And it offers a chance for China to get on well with neighbors through enhancing cross-border trade and collaborative projects and so on. So a kind of opportunities for soft power development. And also things such as energy supplies. The use of the renminbi as an international currency might be one of the impacts of the Belt and Road. And of course, offering a diversification of routes, so that if one route gets blocked, say by civil disturbance or by war or some other unfortunate event, then there are alternative routes available. Okay, that's the Belt and Road. I'm sure there are people here with far greater knowledge about it, but for our purposes, that will do. So I want to turn to the issue of multilingualism in China. Now, at first thought, we don't associate China with multilingualism or multiculturalism. We think of it as monolithic. You know, it's Mandarin speaking and it's Han Chinese. Well, to some extent it is, but to a large extent it isn't. There's actually hundreds of languages spoken in China. There's an estimate of over 300 different languages spoken in China, many of them in decay, not in a very strong state of health, but there are also 55 recognized ethnic minority groups. And there are estimates that there could be many more ethnic minority groups that just don't have the vitality and the cohesion to be considered as a group. But 55 ethnic minority groups occupying quite a large portion of the geography of China makes for multilingualism. And these minorities, some of them were indigenous to China. Others, like the Mongols, arrived through war, through aggressive migration, and so on. Some are highly assimilated with the Han and with other groups, and others are very, I won't use the word separate, but they're distinctive. They're distinctive, and they have quite a cohesive group identity of their own. All right, so I want to look at the main players in this area and talk about Putonghua. Now, Putong just means ordinary, common, or standard. Hua means speech. So it tends to refer to the spoken form of Mandarin. It's based on the northern Chinese dialect, principally around Beijing. I was talking with Anatoly at lunch how power emanates from the capital, and the choice of national language or standard tends to be that of the center of the capital. And that's a part of how the center operates, not just in China, but in the UK with Queen's English, the language of the aristocracy, the language of the educated elite, the language of the people. The dialect of the people around London tends to be the received pronunciation. And it gives them a sense of security and a sense of higher status and so on. But here, this sign actually is from a school in Yunnan province in the southwest. And it just says, please speak Putonghua, 请讲普通话, which is rather interesting because I was actually interviewing the school principal in front of this sign, and he was telling me how his school is multilingual and that they put great emphasis on the local E language and so on and so forth. But he was standing in front of a big sign. He said, please speak Putonghua. All right. So I took a photograph of that to remember it. But Putonghua is a pretty strong language, as we can see here. It was preferred ahead of Cantonese. Now, there is a rumor, and this rumor has been officially declared not true by some of my friends in the Ministry of Education in China, that there was a vote at some stage as to whether Cantonese, which has got a very strong presence in southern China, and is also the historical language of literature in China. Poetry rhymes in Cantonese, but it doesn't rhyme in Mandarin. It's got a strong historical and cultural root in the country. But there was a vote to decide whether Mandarin Chinese, Northern Chinese, or Southern Cantonese should be the national standard. And apparently Mandarin won by one vote. And I've been told this is Hushuo Badao. This is nonsense. This is not true. This never actually happened. Okay? But there are very strong dialects as well. Shanghainese, Fujianese, Chuchao dialect. These are all strong. And there are many varieties of Mandarin. Just like you have Hong Kong Putonghua, with a distinct tone to it and a distinct vocabulary and distinct pronunciation. There are many different forms of Mandarin around the country. And that was one of the concerns that President Xi Jinping actually mentioned. On a tour of the country, he found that these different forms of standard speech were actually mutually incomprehensible. They were so affected by the local dialect that even though they were speaking Putonghua, the two forms of Putonghua were not communicating to each other. They were incomprehensible. So that's why he's been very keen to promote a standard national form of Mandarin so that people can travel around the country, be more mobile, have greater access to mainstream activities and opportunities by having a single standard form of Putonghua. As I say, it's based on the northern grammar and vocabulary. And because of the need for mass education after 1949, when the Communist Party had been very strongly supported by the peasants. And the feeling was that the peasants should have some kind of economic development in the early years of China, led to the simplification of the characters. And the idea that newspapers should use only simplified characters with a limited vocabulary to make it easier for the less educated people to access the language, make it more learnable, and so on. So it's been popularized as a written form as well as a spoken form. Since 2013, as I mentioned, this desire for uniformity has resulted in Putonghua being very strongly promoted in schools, Chinese language given a little more time and more emphasis. And in some areas, it's been the case, such as in Mongolia and parts of Xinjiang and so on, that textbooks and the medium of instruction, which used to be in the local language or the minority language, has now been replaced by Chinese, Mandarin, Putonghua as the medium of instruction, and the textbooks are written in Chinese. Now, apparently, again, according to my friends in the Ministry of Education, this is a temporary measure until Putonghua has got a very strong footing in the country, and then they will return to a greater diversity. Okay, so a little bit more about the minority languages. This is a town in Guangxi province. It's a minority town. This is a Miao town. I just wanted to illustrate some of the things that you find. For example, this sign, you've got Chinese, English, Japanese, and Korean. And this is a minority tourist town. You don't actually find a minority language there. Okay. And you find, occasionally you find little traces of it, but it's quite hard to find. We did a little bit of research into the linguistic landscape of this Miao town, and we found very little evidence of Miao. And the local Miao people said, well, we don't use it apart from daily communication. We don't use it for shop signs and for public signs. We use Mandarin for that, for Chinese. And we have foreign tourists, so we need to have English. And we've got more and more Japanese and Korean tourists, so we have those languages. And the local officials said, yeah, I mean, we're supposed to make public notices in Chinese, that's the law. And not many people can read Miao, so it's a waste of time making signs in Miao. But the tourists said, where's the Miao? We came here for a minority experience. We can see the singing, we can see the dancing, but where's the language? So it struck us as a great opportunity for converting linguistic capital into economic capital being missed. If they could use their own language more and make it more visible, more and more tourists will come. But anyway, that's just an example to show the status of minority language. So minority areas, the ethnic minority areas, they're found in 155 autonomous regions, like prefectures or even a whole province, like Xinjiang is an autonomous region. 55 ethnic minority groups, as I said, but it's over 1 million people we're talking about. And that's much larger than the UK, for example, in terms of population. A lot of them are in the border areas, which can be a little bit sensitive because some of the minority groups have got affiliations, cultural affiliations and language affiliations over the border. And that might threaten the internal cohesion of China a little bit. So some of the areas can be quite sensitive, often rural and underdeveloped, but by no means all. The Korean minority group, for example, are quite affluent, successful in business. They live in northeast China, and they were often refugees from the Korean Civil War who moved to China in the 50s, and China gave them land for free to help them settle. So they always feel very grateful to China, and they always identify themselves very strongly as Chinese, but they keep their Korean culture. But they're certainly not a poor minority, and it'd be wrong to suggest that all minorities in China are poor. Number of languages, over 130. And another key word, ethno-linguistic vitality, just means the strength of the language in the local community. How strong does the community invest in their own language? And in some areas, they invest very strongly. In other areas, they don't put a lot of effort into it. They say, well, we don't really need our minority language. It's much more important that our kids learn Chinese, Putonghua, and able to get into the universities and have greater economic opportunities and to have a better life than we do. And the languages are protected by the Constitution. It is very clearly stated in the Constitution, and Chinese officials are very keen to emphasize this. The minority languages have protection. People have the right to use their minority languages, and they can be used for various official functions as well as for social use. So if we look historically, this is mainly the work by Agnes Lam at Hong Kong U. She talked about the early years after the founding of the People's Republic as being one of nation building and egalitarian respect for the minorities. Later on, it became more political, and there was more of an attempt to assimilate the minorities with the mainstream Han. The Cultural Revolution, time of suppression, and quite a lot of cultural vandalism to the historical relics of the minorities at that time. Afterwards, the rise of egalitarian respect, and from the 1990s, quite a strong push towards encouraging bilingualism, and then with the rise of English and other foreign languages, trilingualism. But since about 2013, and this is around the time of Belt and Road starting, it's not altogether coincidental, there's been some changes to bilingualism and trilingualism. First of all, the promotion of Mandarin, Putonghua, has had I won't say a negative effect. It's just that, let's say that the priority attached to Putonghua is greater than the priority attached to the minority language. I think that's a safe way of putting it. Okay. So what about foreign languages? Well, initially it was Russian. In 1949 till the early 60s, Russian was the main foreign language. I have met teachers of Albanian and Esperanto as well, the world language. But from the early 60s, we find the rise of, speaking with a mask. We find the rise of English for modernization. Now, it's an interesting fact that the four modernizations are often associated with Deng Xiaoping in the late 70s, but actually they were started in the early 60s by Zhou Enlai and other Chinese leaders. That's where they originated. But Heidi Ross, who was a scholar of English in China, she described foreign languages as the barometer of foreign policy. When English was strongly encouraged, the country was open. When the country was closed, English died, like my voice. Having said that, some languages also teach Japanese, Korean, and Russian, and European LOTE, languages other than English. It's a little bit of jargon there that we use. It's impressive, but it's European languages, French, German, Spanish, Italian, so on and so forth. So they were all on offer. Since 1993, English has been put to use by China, not because they love Shakespeare, right? It's because it's a language, it's an international language of trade and diplomacy and so on. So it helps with their soft power. They had important international events like the APEC meeting, the Beijing Olympics, Shanghai World Expo, and also the entry to the World Trade Organization was another big event, all of which required competence in English in the population. And we have English mania. They even have a teaching method called crazy English, right? Very famous method. He's a bad man. You know, they have, it's a really interesting and unusual approach to English language. Yeah. So it became a mania. For example, citizens are learning English, parents persuading, even forcing their children to speak English. You know, I often hear in Hong Kong and in China, parents talking to their children in English, okay, which is all right, provided they remember to talk to them in Chinese as well. Okay, and another interesting thing, by the way, why do people talk to their dogs in English? Come on, Bobby, come on. Hey. And college students are doing English at the expense of their majors. You know, it became so important, English, the important status of English. And this quotation from the New Yorker magazine, English has become an ideology, a force strong enough to remake your resume, attract a spouse, or catapult you out of a village. And these are all the things that English could do. Okay? And in universities, it became crucial for the Gaokao, university entrance, and for graduation. And because of the competition, standards were raised higher and higher and higher. And it even got to the stage where if you failed your college English test, the CET4, and passed your major, you wouldn't graduate. It was a graduation requirement. There was actually a famous court case in Wuhan where some people who didn't get their civil engineering degree sued the university because they passed all their exams apart from college English. But they lost the court case because the judge said, well, this was in your letter of acceptance. When you were accepted to the university at the beginning, it said very clearly, you must pass English to graduate. So you weren't cheated. You know, this was part of the terms and conditions. There's a slight change going on now, and I'll talk about that in a minute. For English, so some allowance was made for minority students because the English provision was not good in some of the rural areas. So they were allowed a lower score. Though this had a negative effect in that employers said, oh, you're a backdoor student, you know, you got lower grades. There was a kind of stigma attached to affirmative action. Okay. But we find more and more courses taught in English and requirements to publish. The academics here who know mainland China will know that you are expected to publish in international journals, usually in English in SSCI journals. And if you fail the foreign language test, even a Nobel Prize winner will be rejected for promotion to professor, senior researcher, or even a class 1 teacher in a school. So English has become such a big thing professionally. As I say, though, there seems to be some kind of reappraisal of English in recent times. One is the double reduction policy, which you might have heard about, which is cutting down on tutorials, tutorial schools, reducing the exam stress on the students. And English has been the language that's suffered the most because of that. Shanghai has banned primary school examinations in English, and they're reconsidering the college English for graduation and the Gaokao for college entrance. And there might be changes to the status of English as a result. Okay, let's move on to higher education. Now, higher education in China has always been strongly aligned with government policy. it's a wing of government policy. It serves to carry out policies of China and to provide the human resources for that purpose. And we can see that historically in the strategic partnerships between higher education institutions and other countries. For example, many African countries are paired with a university in China so that they can provide scholarships and help to develop Chinese interests in the African countries and their development and aid and so on. Now, what has Belt and Road done for the higher education institutes? One is the development of international talents, and I'll talk about them in a moment. We see greater cross-border and foreign languages appearing in the universities, and we also see Chinese being promoted as an international language more. So what is an international talent? Well, there are a lot of them in this room already. An international talent is defined by the Chinese government, someone who has a specialist subject like engineering or law or accountancy. They have a broader global vision. They have some understanding of international norms, culture, and laws, and how to behave in an international intercultural environment. They have the competence for that, and that they are multilingual. So we see multilingualism appearing here in the requirements for international talents. So this is one area that higher education is working on, producing this kind of human resource to help the Belt and Road. So, foreign languages service, we see this huge growth in translation and interpretation as a subject. Okay, to the extent that now there are 259 institutions offering a master's in this area. And in 2008, there were 350 students. Now over 8,000 students are doing masters in this area. So a major increase in this area. And the translation majors include these languages, not just English, which used to be the most common one, but also French, Japanese, Russian, German, Korean, Spanish, Arabic, and Thai, etc. So a huge, very big range of languages now being included in translation and interpretation. And one area that's really boomed, what we call the SALs, South and Southeast Asian languages. And again, to give an example, we had 18 majors in 9 universities in 2008. 2022, 62 majors in more than 40 universities. So to take one of the universities as an example, Yunnan Nationalities University, Thai, Burmese, Vietnamese, Lao, Cambodian, Malay, Indonesian, etc., etc., etc. All these languages are now being taught. And this has a knock-on effect for the minority languages in Yunnan province, which is southwest China, bordering Thailand and Myanmar and so on, Vietnam, with languages which are very similar to languages spoken across the border. Now, until recently, those languages in Yunnan province were in decline. But now they're beginning to show some evidence of at least stabilizing and in some cases actually growing because of their economic value. So we've seen this in Yunnan quite a lot, and I suspect you can find it in other provinces as well. And just a bit of anecdotal information. I see the questioning of English as the only language for higher education. And I was recently working with a colleague on some interviews with minority students preparing for the Gaokao, preparing to go to higher education. And they said instead of doing English as their main foreign language, they were choosing Japanese. Because, number one, they didn't receive very good English teaching in primary school and secondary school, if they received any at all. And also Japanese is linguistically easier for a Chinese person to learn. So like a river always takes the path of least resistance, they're choosing the linguistic path of least resistance. And we interviewed 4 of them. They started Japanese as a foreign language just in senior high school, and all 4 of them successfully entered university. If you compared that to success using English, well, they were very smart. They made the smart choice in that way. And this has got also giving them an area of language which will make them highly employable as part of the overall internationalization of China. Okay. All right, I don't expect you to read all of this, but the Beijing Foreign Studies University now offers 101 foreign languages. And these are the ones they've introduced in chronological order: Russian, obviously, in 1949, then English. And more recently, we have Javanese and Punjabi. So many of these, not all of them, but many of these are Belt and Road languages. And they see themselves very much as the major provider of language training for Belt and Road, the Belt and Road Initiative. So you can see that's a phenomenal commitment of time and resources, teach 101 different languages. And that's, again, quite a new phenomenon. The other area is the growth of Chinese as a foreign language, which has had a little bit of a rocky road, a little bit of a rocky Belt and Road, but it is coming into prominence. Okay. We know about the Confucius Institutes and the Confucius classrooms, which were set up over the last 10 years or so. And these have not always had a happy experience. They were located within universities in different countries. And in some countries, particularly the United States, there was local resistance to the presence of a Chinese cultural unit on campus, and the fear that there might be some interference with the internal politics of the university and so on. Particularly as the Confucius Institute was funded by money from China. And in some cases, in many cases, Confucius Institute has now been closed down, the agreement has terminated. So it's been a little bit of an uneven progression. So now instead, there's a new form of sister university agreements emerging, which are similar but different from the Confucius Institutes. But there still is a view that Chinese has potential to become at least a regional language, if not an international language. And so we can see that places like Beijing Language and Cultural University are setting up an academy to encourage sinologists to collaborate together in the Belt and Road area. So sinologists along the Belt and Road see how they understand Chinese culture and how they might promote it in their countries. So actually bringing in people to promote Chinese culture. So it's not Chinese people going to promote the culture, it's actually the people from the Belt and Road countries coming to learn about Chinese culture so they can then promote it when they go back. So last few slides. I want to sort of give a very rough and ready indication as how I see the impact on multilingualism of what I've been mentioning. This is 2015, when Ding Hongdi and some other colleagues were involved in our big project on multilingualism in China. And I would say at the time, 2015, Putonghua was very strongly promoted at high priority, rising very quickly in importance and status. And it was already top of the tree anyway. English, I would have put in second place. And at that time, it was also becoming more and more prominent, continuing to be more and more prominent. So those two languages were really the premiership in football terms, okay? Then we move on to the championship, and you've got the minority languages, which were steady. Many of them were surviving quite nicely, developing. Some were in trouble, but they were making efforts to revive the language. And then further down, as a rather luxury item, you would find some of these other foreign languages being taught, such as French, German, Korean, and Japanese. And then right at the bottom of the priority list, there would be other foreign languages, all the other, but not so many were gaining very strong traction at the time. If we compare that to today, I would see slightly different trends emerging. Still Putonghua on the way up, still rising and rising. Yeah, English, maybe they're okay. They're not in danger of relegation, but they are not. They're not challenging for the top spot anymore. They're sort of steady in the middle and consistent. And maybe in the next few years we might see it going down a little bit. Maybe the English bubble is not burst, but deflating very gently, I would say. Minority languages receiving a little bit of a boost. Like they got a new manager in, they changed their tactics, and now they're winning more games. So they're improving. They're improving in their position. And these other areas are beginning now to take off quite a bit more. So this is kind of disrupting the patterns that we saw of trilingualism being very strongly Chinese, minority language, and English to a much more complex picture. And this is my conclusion. The BRI is raising the status of relevant and strategic foreign languages other than English. And that is quite a big change. To some extent, there is interest being given to reviving some of the minority languages in China. Certainly, the translation interpretation service industry has had a major injection of interest and resources and so on. So this is a big area sector of the commercial industry that is booming. And to some extent, all this is disturbing the hegemony of English as its position as the totally dominant foreign language in China. And to my mind, as somebody who's sort of worked in English in China now for nearly 40 years, it's a good thing. I think China needs to reassess its relationship with the English language and actually make it less stressful, easier to learn. Don't expect perfection. Practice makes better. Practice doesn't make perfect. We have to realize these things and maybe reduce the role of English as something a lot more reasonable. And if that is an impact that BRI is having, then I think it's a very good thing. Okay, those are my initial opinions. And here are my references. If you're interested in them, I've got 2 pages of references, and we can move to Q&A.